Okay. So, hi everyone again. I'm Zé Antonio. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at PUC-Rio, Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. I'm here with Professor Betania Assi, who is my postdoctoral supervisor, also a professor at PUC-Rio. And here we would like to welcome you to the first meeting of the study group connected to our Speculative Legal Theory network, which is, as you know, an international network that we're starting in order to try to produce connections, productive connections between people who are in one way or another interested in this broad definition, open definition of what might be a speculative legal theory, which we don't know exactly what it is, but we're in a way speculating about what it might be or what it might become. We're very excited about this, and especially we're very excited about having Professor Margaret Davies here with us for our first meeting, where we're going to discuss her very new, very exciting text, EcoLaw, more specifically the introduction and first chapter of that book, which has come out just a few months ago. I would also like to acknowledge Swasti, who is here, who has been helping us also organize a network, and has been one of the people who has gotten close to organizing early. And I would also like to invite everyone who would be interested to, get closer and start participating not only in the study group, but in thinking about what we might do with the network in all other kinds of senses. After all, the study group is just one thing that we're doing, and we're always emphasizing that you don't have to participate often or at all in the study group to be a part of the network. It's just one of the things that we do, though I think it's an important one, right? Since it's a way where we can produce a common ground regarding our understanding of legal theory and of, all of the contemporary problems that it is somehow connected to. So I guess without further ado, I would like to invite Margaret to give her initial exposition about her book, so we can all get on the same page about what we're going to discuss. And also invite everyone to stay if you want until the end, because we would like at the very end to have a little time to also discuss what we're going to do as next steps in the construction of this network. So yeah, please, Margaret, welcome, and we are very excited to hear from
you. Thank you, Tom and Betania, for the invitation. It's my first time in Brazil. I'm very excited. I hope to be there in person at some point. And might I say how lovely it is to see a number of people on the screen or off the screen, as the case may be, who have engaged with the book in the lead up to its publication. So various seminars and so forth that were given last year and even the year before that some of you attended, and those I don't know if you saw the acknowledgements, but those conversations were really incredibly important to me, partly in giving me the drive and the motivation to continue, and also just to build on certain ideas, I guess, that came up in those seminars. So thank you for those people who were there. I'd like also in beginning just to acknowledge that I'm coming to you this evening from the land of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge, as I do in the early stages of the book, that First Nations legal thought has helped me to has helped to show the way for my thinking in recent years, in particular my efforts to develop a concept of law that's more relational and connected to the earth than present models in Western thought. So although I've grounded most of what I do within a Western paradigm and trying to unpack and uncover the potentiality of that, there is always in the background for me the guidance, if you like, of First Nations thinking. So since everyone's had the opportunity to read the first chapters of the book and some associated material, I thought I'd just start with a few introductory comments really and bring out what I thought were the main points. I might say something towards the end about the chapters that you didn't read, but I think I'd probably say enough in the introductory materials about what those are to mean that I don't really need to do that. So I think I've basically got 4 points to draw out here. And the first one is where the book begins with the idea of the nomos, and this is a notion that comes from Robert Cover. Well, in the way that I use it, obviously it's a much older notion than that. It's something that's been used on and off throughout Western philosophy and legal thinking in particular. But the way I've kind of drawn this out is partly by thinking about the relationship between Western legal theory to the physical natural world. And I think that's a fairly complicated, if you look at the terrain of how that has been considered in the past, it's a complicated terrain. So on the one hand, most legal theory has placed the mechanical and deterministic laws of nature into the background. Law of nature is often seen as something that's just not part of legal theory. Those things are placed in diametrical opposition to human law, which is seen as entirely contingent, whereas the natural law tradition is based on a kind of presumptive human nature. It's often claimed to be universal, but it's nonetheless entirely imagined within European and colonialist thinking. So we have physical nature on the one hand as entirely excluded, and on the other hand, we have this idealistic notion of nature as intrinsic to human beings. But the idea, the nomos that I have spoken about in this book and that I've been trying to develop is the kind of in between of those two extremes, in between the deterministic laws of nature and intentionally created human law, and also that idealistic idea of law of nature. There's a field of human and non-human norms that are neither deterministic nor entirely created. And that is what I've taken from Robert Cover. It's been partially studied, I think, by legal theory to the degree that that portion of it that exists within human society and human life, and that are acknowledged as the social conditions of possibilities for formal law. So whether those are social, cultural, political, or linguistic norms, those have been part of the landscape of critical and socio-legal theory for at least 50 years. And so we get from sociology of law, for instance, feminist theory, critical race theory and the like, decolonial studies of law, we get an image of a highly pluralized, dynamic and often conflictual nomos. But that still leaves mostly untouched norms beyond the delimited human sphere. So the non-mechanical norms of nature, the norms of animals, plants, microbes, and the earth that have still been sidelined. So I wanted primarily in this work to bring the normativity of nature beyond the human into play as part of the field of analysis, if you like, of legal theory. And in doing that, it seems to me that a closer engagement by human-centered knowledge traditions with the disciplines and knowledge practices of the non-human physical world is unavoidable. We just need to engage with those knowledge practices that deal with physical nature, the non-human physical nature. And they're multiple knowledges, and they consist in the first place of the many forms of First Nations knowledge, as well as what Western scholarship calls natural science. And I think both engagements are necessary, but my focus in this book has been on thinking with mainstream science and science-informed philosophy as an approach to legal theory. So that's my first point, really just about the nature of the nomos and where it sits in this.
Don, I think we lost her.
Yeah, it went silent and then she disappeared. I hope she is probably going to come back.
My connection just must have dropped out momentarily. Sorry about that. I'm back now. I hope it won't be a problem again. I don't know what that was about. Kind of came back automatically. So the second point I want, is it okay?
Yeah, no.
Yep, okay.
Yeah. So
the second point was about EcoLaw and what's meant by EcoLaw and where do I situate it. And really it's law from the ground up, from, you know, the literal ground up. So rather than law as a human-made tool for guiding behaviour of other humans, or even law that deals with human law, rather, that deals with the physical world or the environment. So I'm not using it to refer to human law that governs humans, the environment or ecosystems, but rather that eco-law is law that emerges from the matter of the world. And that's explained in the book by reference to the distinction that Elizabeth Gross made between biopower and geopower. On the one hand, biopower being top-down human regulation of biological life, and geopower being, you know, the forces of the earth. So I make a similar distinction there, that I say that, you know, the term could refer to human law governing the earth, but I don't mean it in that sense. I mean that it is really about the unlimited domain of law that emerges from life and the earth. And that's really the critical distinction that's made in the book, that eco-law is simply law from the ground up that includes human law as one of its eventual products. And I'm sometimes asked where power, that's my third point, is about power. I'm sometimes asked where power fits into that analysis. And so I thought I'd just try to spell out a little bit the link between normativity and power, or the eco-normativity and power. And it's in one sense quite simple, although I didn't write this in the book for some reason. I didn't actually think of it until later. But really, because you can't think of everything all at once, but really it is, I would think of this by reference to Foucault at the end of a lecture delivered in 1975 that's printed in a book titled Abnormal. Foucault says the norm lays claim to power, and he follows that up with, the norm is an element on the basis of which a certain exercise of power is founded and legitimised. And he's writing in relation to Canguilhem, who has written about vital normativity, but also about the way, it's actually quite interesting as a sort of springboard for Foucault in the way that he talks about, Canguilhem talks about the transformation of what he has said about vital normativity into the social world. But anyway, there's this connection here between norm and power that I think is made fairly simply and that we are familiar with through Foucault's work, that norms and the processes of normalization are constitutive of power. And it would be perhaps possible to say that norms are the mechanisms of power, not the mechanical mechanisms of power, but nonetheless they are how power emerges, how power is formed, whether we're talking about social and legal norms or biophysical norms. So even though my focus in the book is on norms and law, I would say that power and the political are never very far away from that. Norms are the means of, in a sense, focusing movement and energy into power. So bionorms and geonorms constitute the multiple forms of biopower if you're looking at biopower as power from the ground up, and also geopower. In other words, if we want to understand power, we also have to look at norms, and that's what I've been doing. And the fourth introductory point I would make is really about the connection of non-human and human norms. And this is elaborated in the material that you've read, so I'll just outline it quickly, but it is actually quite important to the structure of the book. But I see that there are two ways of connecting human law to non-human law. The first is by way of comparison, and the second is by way of continuity. And when we're speaking of comparison, it relates to there being a similar idea of norm and normativity for both the natural or non-human and the social expressions of norms. And this is elaborated in the book through the idea of iteration or repetition and bonds as the basic structure of norms, coupled with purpose or direction or teleology. So I talk about those three things, repetition, bonds, and teleology as characteristic of normativity in general, and then use that kind of idea of normativity to track between the non-human and the human concepts or expressions of normativity. And they are always kind of material, they are always grounded in material and physical facts. So, this is in a sense going back to Law Unlimited, but I think the characteristic idea of norm that I've always gone back to is the idea of a path, that a path that's made by repeated movement over the same place is an excellent example of actually a norm. I would say the path itself is a norm because it shows the way to go, or if it might be a pathway in your neural system, brain pathway that enables you to think. Same thing, it's also a norm. So the second way of thinking about the connection between human and non-human norms is by way of continuity. And this one is in one way obvious, but in other way not that obvious. And it really just is from the observation that everything human is part of nature. So there's a sense in which we're just embedded, but it needs to be kind of elaborated that human law is a complex emergence from nature, not a direct or linear one. There's no direct translation from the physical world into the human world. There's always these multiple layers of physical patterns that have arisen over billions of years and are sedimented in different ways in life and in the earth. That gives rise to where we are now. So those sedimentations of norms, if you like, are characterized by probability, not mechanism, characterized by diversity, not singularity, and by complexity and not linearity. And I described that in the passage you've read, I think, as a shift in orientation. So rather than draw a boundary around the human organism and looking out from the human organism, rather to situate us within a larger framework and start from there. And I'd say as well, there's elements of flat ontology in there, but it's not an entirely flat. It's more flat than entirely human-centered view, but it's actually layered or stratified because of this sedimentation that produces norms and systems of norms over a long period of time. So those are my 4 points. The connection of human and non-human, the point about power, the point about what EcoLaw is, and about the nomos. And then really the chapters, you've read chapter 1, which kind of is an outline of the entire book. Chapter 2 deals with teleology, and it's also a bit of background really to explore the way that the physical natural world has often been seen as non-agential and as non-teleological or non-purposive. So I explore the philosophy and history to do with that, and some of the science, I guess, to do with that representation of the non-human world as basically passive, and put that in, make the argument that it is actually teleological and purposive. So actually, I think reasonably well accepted by scientists and a lot of philosophers these days. Not all scientists. Chapter 3 is about biogenesis and jurisgenesis, and it is basically an exposition of the work of Georges Canguilhem and Jacob von Uexküll. So Canguilhem is associated with this idea of vital normativity, or the normativity that arises from life. And that was, when I started reading Canguilhem, I realised that I had the argument for the book really, because there's so much in Canguilhem, and I've really just started in this book to unpack it, but there's a huge amount more that could be said about that in connection to legal philosophy. And then von Uexküll, who wrote about the creation by organisms of a phenomenal world through the different sensory capacities that are associated with different species. And I make the point, but again, it's not really unpacked, it's just a beginning of a point, that this gives rise to a kind of second order normativity, which is based on shared understanding and shared information in social groups. And the 4th chapter, which is kind of just, again, a set of interesting points, but it's my favourite chapter in a way, because it's about what I call Geo Law, and it's really just about flow and turbulence as the things that kind of inform all of everything, and it has potential, I think, to open into theory around Gaia. I had to read a lot of thermodynamics to even get my head around some of this, but I use the idea of flow as basic to the normativity of non-life. So I take the examples of water and energy, and I suggest in that chapter that directional flow indicates a kind of normativity, and that both water and energy can be seen as regulators in different ways. And interestingly, they both bring into play the relationship or the mutuality between order and chaos. So as I say, that's my favourite chapter, because it's about the movement that underlies everything. And chapter 5 tries to situate various of these themes in relation to sections of existing legal theory, natural law theory, positivist theory, and also the distinction between autopoiesis and sympoiesis. But it was a short book. I couldn't fit too much in there, and basically I just had to kind of give a short indication of what I thought was possible in legal theory. So I see it as a space for potentiality of speculation, rather than a fixed kind of approach or static theory about law. So I think I'll leave it there. I think that's probably enough from me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for your exposition. I would like everyone to start thinking about their questions and comments. I think Betania has a comment to make.
Thank you.
I thought you were raising your hand, but you just meant like the applause, is that it? Afterwards, okay. Basically, I was thinking that as a kind of a way to start our discussion and to kind of give some coherence to the group, I would like to ask you briefly about, the connection between your work and specifically this new work and the idea that we are trying to advance and to give consistency to around this notion of speculative legal theory, right? And usually, I don't know how many of the people who are here have read that little document that we use to explain the idea of the group, but basically we have been trying to define this idea of speculative legal theory around two related senses of speculation, one more philosophical and one more concrete or more everyday sense of the word speculation, and specifically of the transition between the idea of critique and that of speculation. So in terms of philosophy, we have been interested in a number of contemporary philosophical and theoretical discussions that seem to reverse, in a way, the fundamentally Kantian movement in Western thought, which prioritizes critique and in a sense prioritizes epistemology over ontology or metaphysics. So to prioritize a critical approach to the conditions of possibility of human knowledge of the external world. So putting this gap between subject and object at the very center of philosophical thought, and in that way sort of canceling or making secondary at least what would have been traditionally a more primary aspect of philosophy, which would be the questions about things themselves, about the world out there. So in this sense, a passage from critique to speculation would mean to rehabilitate this philosophy of the great outdoors, this way of thinking about reality in a way that is not separate or that is not conceived as secondary in relation to the problem of the correlation between the knowing subject and the known object, right? And in terms of a more colloquial sense, and which brings into the discussion the more applied aspects of law and of legal studies that are also implied here, we have a difference between criticizing the actual institutions of law, of the state, of what we traditionally understand as law, or of our acquired image of law. And we don't think that has ceased to be important at all, but we are trying to supplement that critical attitude in relation to our received image of law with an imaginative, speculative, or prefigurative attitude. And prefigurative is a term that I take from Margaret's own work, in relation to what law might be, both in the sense of what it might become or what it might turn out to be, but also of what we might find out that law has always been or has been for a long time, which has to do, I think, a lot with the geological and ecological dimensions of law. So in that sense, that we are trying to define this idea of speculative legal theory, we are sort of affirming Margaret here as a speculative legal theorist, which is not, I think, a term that she has ever used to define herself. So I would like to ask you, Margaret, in a way, how you would position yourself in relation to this definition and to this way of framing this, because in a way we are sort of choosing a perspective of choosing a way to frame this among various different and overlapping ways of framing this contemporary discussion that have been emerging recently and with different time frames, such as speculative or speculative realism or speculative materialism, which are terms that are more used in philosophy, new materialisms, which have been quite transdisciplinary and appearing in different parts of the humanities, object-oriented ontology, which is sometimes a part of speculative realism, or assemblage theories. Also, feminist epistemologies have a very close proximity to this. Actor network theory. All of these seem to be different ways of looking at the same set of questions and of sometimes organizing the same contemporary discussions. Among those different texts, I particularly reading your work, I tend to see you as closer to new materialisms, or as more aligned with the new materialist interpretation of this whole discussion. But I would like to know what you think about this idea of choosing speculative, or framing this around the idea of speculation, and specifically how you would relate that to your idea of a prefigurative legal theory, which I think is one of the terms that gives a lot of connection between what we are trying to do here and your work. And this is especially because, as I already said, I think you're certainly one of the thinkers, if not the thinker today in legal theory, that has been doing the most relevant work in terms of bringing all of these discussions into legal theory. So it's really incredible to have you here for our first conversation.
Thank you. I don't know that I can do credit to all of the different aspects of the speculative that you outlined there, but definitely it's a term that you're correct to say, Tom, that I haven't used it specifically in relation to my work. I've used the term prefigurative, and by prefigurative, I've usually meant it was something akin to performative, but it's really about, drawing out from the present what's possible, or the potential of the present and the past, but to make something different of it that is possible for the future. So it's trying to push or reframe or perform legal theory in a way that, or prefigure legal theory for the future, as opposed to just analysing or describing or whatever. So you're actually doing something with legal theory that is future oriented, but obviously it has to be grounded in what already exists, in a sense. And I always have used the example of Jeremy Bentham as the as the prefigurative legal theorist, and John Austin, actually, because Austin in particular wrote a positivist idea of law, which didn't actually exist and wasn't really adopted at that time, but it became through this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy almost. It became the truth about law, and it became the operative concept of law, and people started behaving as though it was the law. So I think that prefiguration is a strategy for reform and for change. And you don't necessarily know where it's going to go, but that's how I've been using the concept of prefiguration also building on the work of Davina Cooper, I should say, in this field, who has written a lot about prefiguration. So, but, you know, the term speculation seems to push, in a sense, I don't know whether this is what you mean, but push one step further, so even beyond, but to open up the experimental side. And I guess that's what I have done with this book, is to experiment a lot more with the concepts and with the possibilities of thinking about law. So in the past, I was still kind of very much grounded in human normativity, the pluralism. I mean, there's been a whole trajectory here of theory about legal pluralism, theory about materialism, and you know, transforming that into a kind of idea about the human social normativity and how that connects to what we call state law. But I did really want to go further than that, because once, I think I say somewhere in that first chapter, once you start talking about, you know, human beings as bodies and as material physical entities, you can't kind of just draw the line. You have to open out into the rest of non-human nature as well. So so yes, I think I've lost the track of exactly what you defined as speculative, but I definitely agree that that's a big part of what I'm trying to do, is actually to open out even further than or to go further than what I have previously spoken of as prefigurative. And there are many other aspects to that as well. I mean, you spoke at the beginning about the Kantian kind of worldview, and I have been thinking about this a lot recently, the fact that, and its relationship to epistemology. There's a very interesting, I've been reading a bit more of Canguilhem, and there's a very interesting essay that he wrote, a book actually called Knowledge of Life. And the first essay is about knowledge of life. And he really makes the point that knowledge is of life. It emerges from life. It's not something separate from life, and life isn't kind of somehow excluded from life, whereas Kant excluded life from knowledge in many respects. And many people have excluded life from knowledge, whereas Canguilhem wrote that as we are natural beings, we are biological beings, our knowledge is not only about life, it is actually comes from life. And that's where we situate ourselves. It's quite a different point from that distinction that Kant made. So yeah, that is a kind of naturalism in a way, but it's not a reductive naturalism.
Thank you so much. Yeah, people have been.
I see there are hands up, so yeah.
Yeah. So everyone, if you have questions, you can use this. I think we can use the order of raised hands to make it organized. So I think Swasti is the first one in line.
Thank you, Zay. Thank you, Professor Davies, for that. Actually, the last point is where I want to pick up on the speculation and builds on Zay's question. But you have a very interesting way of looking at natural law in this, which moves away from traditional understanding of natural law. And there's a sentence in your book which says that natural law is not grounded and it seems to exist everywhere, or something like, I'm paraphrasing that sentence. And it's a very interesting way of looking at natural law, especially when we think about EcoLaw as having emerged in the way that you described from grounds up. And I was wondering how you reached that understanding of natural law while working with an EcoLaw that was ground up. So that's my first question. And the other thing I was actually, just to ask this question about relationality and the way you discuss relationality and continuity between the human and the non-human, or how we relate to the human and the non-human through your work. There's a critique of relationality that you have, which is that relationality is and I'm using these words, relationality is inexhaustive, or it cannot be the complete sense of the human and non-human connections. And in that sense, is that what you think of as potential or speculative? Is there a critique that we could pursue in this context? Does that make sense? I don't know.
I might need to ask you further about that second point. Yeah. But in relation to the first, I think where I said that natural law is everywhere and it's lacking space and time, I think. It's everywhere and nowhere. I mean, what I was talking about in that context actually was traditional classical natural law theory. And so the natural law theory that has relied on this kind of essential idea of human nature, which and the idea of natural law that says it's the same in all places and at all times. It's eternal and unchanging. That idea of natural law, which has ancient origins but has been developed more recently by secular and non-secular natural law theorists in the Western tradition. So I would definitely reject that kind of natural law as any sort of association with what I've been writing about. And it's for that reason that I kind of hesitated to use the term natural or even to associate what I was doing in any way with a kind of concept of natural law. But on the other hand, it was put to me, and I have some sympathy with this view, that maybe the idea of natural law needs to be reappropriated, and natural law can be, or the idea of natural law can be placed in the physical natural world, not just in some reified notion of human nature, and certainly not in timeless and spaceless kind of area, field or whatever, but that it is actually emergent from physical nature. So that's what I was trying to do, and I think that maybe I didn't make that entirely clear, but when I was speaking about natural law as being everywhere and nowhere, I think I was talking about the classical natural law theory, because EcoLaw as law from the ground up is really about, it's emergent, and it's very grounded and very, very much located in space, very much emergent through time and different in different times and places. So yes, I might have to ask you to elaborate your second point a little bit more. It was about relationality.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking alongside the discussion on how does he think of your work as speculative? I mean, we would want to think of your work as speculative, and one of the ways in which I think your work is speculative is in identifying how humans and non-humans, the relationality between the humans and non-humans gets established within legal theory or no. How do we create that normative universe, which really ties down to questions to what you do in chapter 4. I haven't reached chapter 4, but it was more of me thinking alongside these questions. So we don't need any answers. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'll come back to it when we have more time. So shut up. Yeah.
Okay.
So, Akshay?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. It was a fantastic piece. My question is, first, the simple, could you please explain that you explained it actually, but I could not pick it up. What was normative law before you started writing and what it has become now? And that is my first question. And second question is,
sorry, can you elaborate that question a little bit more? What was
natural normative law before you started writing, and what it is becoming now after you started writing? I want to. It's like that's the first question. Did I make sense?
Yes, I think so. I think I can interpret your question. I'm not entirely sure what you mean, but I'll give it a go. Yes.
Yeah. Second question is, you refer Nobel laureate Ilya Prigogine, chemistry.
Yes.
Yes, he was deeply in conversation with Vedanta and Tantra, which is a what you can call it as a philosophy emerging from, in India. And
Right.
it is in one of the school tells that everything is universe has life, including stones and all that. So he wrote a paper which eventually became a base for smart materials like superconductor, like memory chips and processors. So taking that as a point, like Ilya Prigogine, he reduced the idea, the philosophy which was in India with Vedanta only to materials, but he did not, as far as I've read in his book, he did not complete it in say to all life forms. Now, when we read actually the text in India, it tells all life is smart, all life has soul, all life has its own soteriological end without the human end. So my question is coming back, would you have a complete debate with, say, going to Prigonine's sources, which is Sanskrit sources, or else would you simply stop it with Prigogine?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I'd love to know more about that actually, because it sounds really fascinating. I hadn't actually drawn any connection between him and any Sanskrit sources at all. I didn't realize that there was such a thing. So, I mean, to me, that's fascinating. So really all I've done with him is just to read some of his, I guess they're actually popular science books. So the book that he wrote with Isabel Stengers in 1987 called Order Out of Chaos, I think that's what it was called. Anyway, which deals with the issues of how order emerges in the physical world, and they gesture towards the connection there with human life and human society, even though it perhaps isn't fully developed. So, but I haven't taken it any further than that, and I think it would be very interesting to know more. I don't know that side of his work. And the first question you asked was, what was natural normativity before I started writing compared to what it is after I started writing. So are you suggesting, I mean, I was trying to explain how I see natural normativity and connecting it to what we understand to be legal normativity, and drawing upon sources from science and from the various philosophers of science, biophilosophers in particular, that have spoken to the question of normativity in the natural physical world. So really, but there's a lot of tensions in this idea, because obviously traditional mainstream science has seen the physical natural world as being somewhat passive, and they haven't seen it as purposive. There's still a strong streak of determinism mechanism in any scientific explanations, even of biology. So there's quite a lot of tension and quite a lot of conflict in all of these explanations of the physical world. So instead of engage with all of that material, what I've tried to do is to pick up the ones that were useful to my argument and that do seem to engage in the project of prefiguring or speculating that open potential for understanding law in a different way rather than close it down. So I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but that's really to elaborate a little bit on where I was going with some of that work.
I think Daniel is next.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Margaret. Very good to see you. And thanks to the organisers for organising this excellent event. I've got I guess a couple of comments, questions. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, really based on rereading these pages again, but also the comments you made at the beginning, Margaret. So the first is around this question of nomos. And obviously, as you set out, nomos is traditionally distinguished from phusis, and what you're working through is a kind of deconstruction, I suppose, of the nomos phusis distinction. But then you retain the nomos as your kind of central concept. I was wondering if you thought about, when you were writing this, whether another concept needed to be developed to describe what it is that you're describing. This, I don't know, if you comparatively, you might think of Latour's effort to get beyond nature, thinking of nature in oppositional terms to culture, and the elaboration of Gaia, or the whatever it is he calls it, the metaphoric what does he call it in that Gaia book? Anyway, or nature culture, as Haraway describes it. I guess I'm interested in the way in which you retain this concept, which has been traditionally set in opposition to the natural world, and what that might mean. And then the other thing was about power and force, because I was struck rereading the chapter. I was asking, well, where does force feature here, or what's the distinction between norm and power, norm and force? And I was recalling that distinction that Hart makes between having an obligation and being obliged, so that the gunman who threatens you may feel obliged to hand over the money, but it doesn't mean that you have an obligation. So in kind of liberal theory, the distinction between that which is normative and that which is forceful is an important distinction. And I was wondering, is that kind of distinction relevant to your conception of normativity or not? And then another way of thinking about it would be in relation to the Foucault that you referred to. And my understanding would be that Foucault suggests that there is a priority to power that is then articulated through modes of normalization and normativity and so forth. Whereas, am I right in saying that perhaps for you there is a priority to norm and normativity, or at least in the book there is a priority given over the question of force or power. So yeah.
Interesting question. So the first one, I think I'm more in, it's really hard to come up with ideas that go beyond the ideas that we currently work with. So, and I would say that I don't really, in some ways I do, but I haven't seen what I've been doing as deconstructing nomos and phusis. Rather, I'm basically reinterpreting phusis as nomos. So in a sense, everything is phusis. Everything is nomos. Everything that is nomos. And you could use either term actually, except that nomos is the one that's associated with normativity. But definitely, the idea is to redefine or extend nomos so that it is re-implanted back in the physical world. Nomos and phusis then become indistinguishable in a sense, except that of course there are, I guess, elements of phusis that are about chaos and about non-normative, non-movement that hasn't yet become normative in a sense. So that's where I stand on that particular point. And the second one about power and force, well, that's an obligation and obliged, also a really tricky point. But I think I do see the point you made about Foucault, that power informs a kind of normalization or normativity. Well, I think, probably I don't know enough or I don't have it at the, at the top of my mind in terms of Foucault to know whether that is how I would interpret his work, but it doesn't really matter in a sense, because I think that the two things are kind of mutually reinforcing. I would put normativity first, because I think, although maybe not, maybe the teleology could be seen as a kind of power or force, that movement or direction that then creates normativity. So ordinarily, I would say that normativity comes first and power comes second, that power emerges from the consolidation of norms, and the processes of normalization produce power, and that may then be reinscribed back into further normalization in quite elaborate ways, and sometimes quite specific ways. So the two things aren't necessarily separate, but as I said, my purpose has really been to look at norms and normativity. As to the issue of, the difference between being obliged and having an obligation, no. So all of that is kind of secondary. So I've put all of what is understood to be legal norms or legal obligations, legal ideas at the secondary level, and I'm trying to go underneath that from the ground up to talk about what comes, the materialities that produce those things, and they're always there, but they're not necessarily implied or inscribed within the levels of normativity that I've been writing about. Yeah, maybe I just haven't got that far yet. It's a lot more to be done. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Dan? Thanks. Who's next? I think Tom's left us momentarily.
No, I think he's here, and I think it's my turn, because
yes,
I'm going to.
Be.
Okay, thank you very much, Margaret, for being with us today. This is such a privilege to have you here in this open section. I'm very excited. And also for the wonderful job you have been doing with legal critical thinking in many, many ways. And that's a completely different kind of work. So we were a little bomb, no? That's your work, and it's outstanding. And I would have many questions, but one thing that for the time being concerns me, and please feel free if you think that it doesn't cover your interests, but I had somehow the impression that by taking Canguilhem's vitalism, somehow, if we think in terms of a Foucault dialogue with Canguilhem, the power issue was always there, and power in terms of cultural and human relationship. So somehow the idea of this whole inspiration and dialogue between Foucault and Canguilhem, it is to bring the discussion of vitalism of Canguilhem into the arena of biopolitics. What the idea that, I haven't read, unfortunately, the whole book yet. I will do that, but from the piece you gave to us, somehow you are pushing vitalism further. Let's say, I'm using not the right terms, but beyond the realm of politics or human power relationships. Let me put it that way, previously. And if I take the Amerindian perspectivism as my paradigm to see to get work, I would say, coming a little bit to the Daniel's question, in Amerindian perspectivism, the whole thing is that we have to change the conception of nature, because everything is culturally nature. So somehow you have to, in emergent perspectivism, you take the river point of view. Everything has a point of view. And that has a huge political implication on the field of legal theory. I was wondering if you have thought about which kind of political or ethical implication you would see in kind of a putting outside natural normativity and legal normativity in that field. I mean, in this new idea of EcoLaw, is there any place left to use those categories into the sphere of politics and ethics? Do you see ethical and political implications in your project? Thanks a lot, and thank you again for the generosity of being with us today.
So just in terms of the first issue around Canguilhem and Foucault, so I had always, so again, you know, I'm not an absolute expert in either of these writers, but I had kind of understood that Foucault took Canguilhem's notion of vital normativity and then applied it as a kind of analogy. So he applied the form of normativity from Canguilhem and applied it within the you know, within the human, social, and political sphere. So instead of making that kind of direct kind of continuity, it was more in the field of a comparison. So using that notion of the norm that Canguilhem had developed, but also, of course, there's an essay at the end of The Normal and the Pathological by Canguilhem, in which he writes about how his concept of the norm can be really translated into the human realm. And that's a very important and powerful essay that Foucault then kind of took up in his lectures and developed into Discipline and Punish, essentially, as it appears to me, although I haven't traced all of these and I haven't read everything that exists about that topic, but that's as it seems to me. So, but he's taken it as really an analogy, and that kind of continuity between those two fields of normativity wasn't really established, even though Canguilhem gestured towards it, and Foucault probably did as well towards the end of his writing. So, and in terms of this, the perspectivism, so I'm just beginning an engagement with that, and I haven't read a great deal, but I think there is a lot of commonality between what I'm talking about and what exists from that point of view, but maybe not everything. So you said that perspectivism has this view that everything in a sense is nature, and that culture is placed back within nature, which is absolutely consistent, and also consistent with what I've been doing, but also the idea that everything has a perspective. And certainly I have, you know, in chapter 3 of the book, I talk about von Uexküll, who did write about the phenomenal world that is developed by every organism that has any kind of sensory input-output or sensory processing system can develop does develop a phenomenal world that is then their world. But I think that doesn't go quite as far, and I accept that and I use that a little bit in the book. Perhaps don't develop it as much as I could, but I think that then there's a kind of another step that I haven't quite worked out for myself between that and the idea. I'm not saying I disagree with it, but I just haven't quite got there yet, because I know that the way that I do these things is just keep learning new ideas and extending what I've already done into those new fields. So I haven't quite moved from that point into the point that the river has a perspective, or the stone has a perspective, or that the non-living items have a perspective. So these are things that I haven't quite come to yet in my own thinking, but I certainly don't I certainly don't rule them out. I think that it's just a step that I haven't got to yet. Does that answer the question?
No, yeah. I just to add a little bit, Margaret. In perspectivism, everything is culturally, in the sense that everything has the capacity to take the human perspective. In the sense
yeah,
of,
right. Yes. This is something different again.
So everything is political. Everything who has a point of view, it's part of the political arena. So my question was, I mean, is there an ethical political implication in the way you are articulating your project?
So I would put that in a different way, probably, and the way I would put it is the necessity to challenge the nature culture distinction, and also which is an engagement with the current politics that we already have. It's not necessarily an imminent ethics. Again, it's possibly something that I just haven't developed sufficiently, or a question that I haven't turned my mind to, but definitely, you know, to me there is a politics in stepping outside what we understand to be kind of the sphere of human law, and placing that within a much wider context, and that is, you know, to understand the place of humanity, nature. So it's that sense of politics or ethics that I would speak to, but it doesn't go close to what you're talking about in terms of the politics that's emergent from, or the ethics that's emergent from the fact that everybody can take on this, or everything within the physical world can take on this perspective. So it's perhaps a different thing. I need to think more about that.
Thank you very much. Tiago,
Thank you so much, Professor Betania. I'd like to thank Professor Margaret for sharing her intuitions, prefigurative or not, with us and thoughts this morning. And to Tom and Betania for the kind invitation. I'm a very enthusiast of this network. And I fear my question or comment will turn out to be trivial, but I'll do it anyway. Professor, right from the beginning of your book, from the very introduction, nomos is evoked or alluded as a crucial, a central, powerful, inspirational, and encompassing concept, right? Which you take mostly from Robert Cover's version of nomos. It is also a important concept in my own work with African, Brazilian diasporic modes of existence. But my question would be, it caught my attention because Schmidt is not mentioned. And you could expect an earthly concept of nomos, such as the Schmittian one, would appear or would communicate somehow with the sort of normativity you are constructing as EcoLaw. I won't mention Deleuze's nomos, I think it's another thing, but in this relation, in this conversation, which would be refused probably by these two authors. Maybe they would never engage in dialogue, Schmidt and Cover, for other aspects, including religious ones. But is this is this some sort of choice of yours? And what are the implications of this engagement with Cover's, which turns out to be, in the end, a very narrative concept, although he starts his work talking about a wordly nomos, of this, let's say, narrative version of the nomos. What are its implications in detriment of an earthly gesture such as the Schmittian one in this construction of this normativity you call EcoLaw?
Yeah, good questions. So in terms of Schmidt, I just, you know, I obviously been aware of Schmidt, but I have assumed and thought that his concept of nomos was still a human nomos. It was a nomos of the earth, so it was about the ordering of human beings, human law, international law of the earth. So I might be incorrect in that, but it felt to me that, and every time I've looked into that book, it hasn't felt that it has been this kind of earth generated nomos. So I could be wrong, and there might be a lot in Schmidt that I could learn from. In terms of sorry, I've just gone blank. I had your second point in my head and now I've forgotten it. Can you remind me where we went from after Schmidt?
It's probably something.
Oh, Robert Cover, yes, I've got it. Robert Cover. Yeah, no, you're quite right. That so his idea of nomos is, as you say, it starts out, you know, in the beginning of that piece, nomos and narrative, as a very broad concept, and even starts with a little inscription that's from a poem about order and chaos, which seems to, you know, suggest some of the things that I say, and so he does talk about a kind of universe, but then he brings it back to narrative, and he even brings it back to quite, you know, conventionally unified communities with their own singular narratives. And of course, this has been commented upon in his idea of nomos. So it's not that I use the entirety of his notion of nomos, just the kind of wider sense of it that he introduces. But you know, the other senses are also there. They are also part of the nomos. They are just not exclusive of it in the way that I'm talking about it. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that narrowing down of his idea. But there's been critique of that from various writers. So, but I think it's still a worthwhile kind of idea, and that's what I wanted to take from it: the idea that there is a normative universe, and that everything, you know, everything that we are, and everything that we do, everything that we engage in, everything that we know, is kind of, you know, shaped by norms. And that's how we live. So yeah, as I say, I might be wrong about Schmidt, but I didn't find anything. But probably I need to go back. I do have the book on my shelf. I just haven't read it for a while.
Yeah. So since there's no one in line right now, I think, right? I have another question that I think might be useful, which is one part that I really like of what we've read so far of your work is the way you are expanding the concept of norm in order to account for this gradual transition not as something completely bifurcated, but as a gradual transition between norms as regularities and norms as guidance for action. I think that's somewhere where your work gets kind of technical in a way, in the sense that it gets closer to the specifics of determining, norms, and maybe opening the way for not only, a general philosophy of what law might be, but also for us to actually map out this different kind of law. And that's something that I've also been trying to do in a way that I think has a lot of similarities. But one thing that always perplexes me, I think, and makes this project difficult is that those norms that are embedded and that are not made transcendent in relation to the patterns and the systems and the organisms and ecosystems that instantiate them, is that it's hard to point to them or to make them explicit in a way. I mean, when you discuss, for example, the normativity or the norms that are involved in the slime mold and its relation to its environment, it's hard to, even though you're giving a concrete example of the slime mold, it's hard to give a concrete example of the norm, because it seems that once you enunciate it, like once you turn it into a normative proposition, you would be already saying something different, right, from the norm as it is embedded there. So my question would be, how you see this question, between the relation between the norm as it is there in the world as embedded and its formulation. Like, how can we establish some kind of connection to these norms, and specifically considering that we need to take, geopolitically and economically and normatively, we need to take considerable action in relation to changing our normative relations with our normative environment. It would seem that for us as collectives, as human and non-human collectives, but from the perspective of human collectives, let's say, we might need, I think, to be able somehow to map out those non-human normativities, to transpose them somehow, and to connect them more intensely to our own more specific normative and legal systems. So I would like to know a little bit how you see this question of how to map out, or how to connect, or how to relate in any way, whatever term you would think is more adequate, to those normativities, considering that they are not explicit in the way that we are used to when we are dealing with law, right?
That's a great analysis. I really like that analysis of, because it's true, there are a lot of embedded, or there are a lot of norms that we live without being able to articulate that we are living those norms. We don't actually even think about the fact that we're metabolizing something, our dinner or our breakfast or whatever. Those are things that go on behind the scenes, but I've described those processes as normative, but there's no way of actually kind of pulling them out of that and representing them in, or reflecting upon them. Certainly can't change them. We need them to be there. They are kind of, the embedded normative existence that we have, and that defines us. So, and then counterposed to that, you do have the more reflective. You have the chosen, the kind of, and some of them are not chosen, but they're kind of semi-chosen. So we know that they're there, and we could choose not to follow, or we could choose to follow or not to follow. A lot of social norms fall into that category, that they are embedded, they're created by iteration. They're somewhat embedded, but we can also name and identify them, and then if we choose not to follow, we can do that. So there are endless numbers of social norms that are in that middle field as well. So I guess the question is how you can then truly pull out those more imminent norms. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's a really interesting issue as to whether that is possible. I don't know whether it is possible, because obviously there's trillions of them. And my objective was really just the objective to kind of analyze the biophysical matter as normative, so that we normativity, but actually identifying and pulling them out, well, you need to be a scientist to be able to do that. And then, you know, you've still got this disjuncture. I mean, it's very difficult, and I mean, it would almost seem to be a bit of a God project to want to do that, or maybe not, you know. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think the analysis was a really good and clear one.
Thanks so much. Actually,
Yeah, this is a continuation to the last question which was asked just now. Before Savigny came, I don't know how to pronounce his name, German comparative law, legal theorist. The law itself was multiple. Like I'm reading Jorge Esgura's books and articles on Spanish America. There was multiple laws, multiple languages, until Germans came in 1870s and said everything should be mapped to Aryan Romans and Latin. And the Latin and the Roman legal system became the norm and the standard, and everything was mapped to that. So, like, can we imagine a law beyond Latin language or Latin terms? That is my question. Thank you.
So yes, I mean, what you say has actually been part of my inspiration. The fact that, you know, within Western history and across the world, there is this plurality or multiplicity of laws and legal systems. And actually, going back 20 years, I wrote quite a lot about legal pluralism, and it helped me build up this picture of an intrinsic plurality to law. So obviously competing against that image of plurality has always, or maybe not always, but has, as you say, since at least the 19th century, in some places earlier, been counterposed by this notion of singularity or unification of law and legal systems, and, you know, in Western Europe, placed within the Roman tradition, but elsewhere placed within the common law tradition or something else. So, but I've been trying to articulate, I guess, that even though we have, say, within any particular nation state, this concept of a unified legal system, that in addition to or beyond that or informing that is nonetheless a material plurality of laws. So that is always there, regardless of whether there's one legal system or plural human legal systems that govern that particular space, that the ecological plurality of law is always necessarily there and always existent in that framework. Does that answer? I think that's probably what I've got to say about that. I hope that answers the question. I wish I could read all the chat. There's a lot of interesting things in there. Yep, sorry.
I think I can send you like the material from the
transcript
chat afterwards. Yeah, and also I think you can download it somewhere if you want.
Yeah, that might be beyond my skills.
Mary?
Yeah, if we still have a couple of minutes, I would love to just jump in with a question that follows up actually on your question, Antonio. But first, thanks so much for setting up this this very important network. It has been really such a pleasure to have another opportunity to engage with this magnificent book, and to create this little community. And I wanted to come back to the question you asked, Antonio, and the response that you offered, Margaret, because it seems that in your response to Antonio, you were saying that the main intervention, let's say, of your work is especially a diagnostic one, where basically you are trying to really make it really to emphasize or stress how a bit all the limitations of Western thinking, Western knowledge production, Western knowledge transmission, etc., and how human normativities have always been entangled with non-human normativities, etc., etc. But I was wondering if we take, so you really pay so much attention and describe it so beautifully, how non-humans have their own normativities that are entangled with humans ones, and basically how these relations are entangled, etc., etc. But I was wondering what this implies then for legal relations. And although I understand your intervention as really being a diagnostic one, I wanted to hear a little bit more from you, how you would sense or what you think we could make sense of these non-human normativities for legal relations. So thinking really this entanglement between normativities to take it to the realm of legality, and how we can rethink legality, forms of legal norms, let's say, that take on these entangled human and non-human normativities. I don't know if my question makes sense. It's a very broad one, but
no, it makes sense, and you know, that might have to be the next book. So you're quite correct that the approach has been a diagnostic. That's a very good word. I've just been trying to, you know, develop concepts and map out a kind of field that I think is open to, you know, placing law differently. And the point was really to expand the field of legality so it is prefigurative and speculative in that sense, because I have had this kind of aim as part of that, to expand legality and to look into what I see as a necessary material basis of all aspects of human law as well as non-human law. So it is a diagnostic approach. But the question of how, so I'm probably lacking in imagination for your question, actually, because I've expended all of my intellectual efforts at the moment on creating this this image, and I haven't got that far yet. But I think, to me, the important thing was actually just to say it. You know, to speak to the entanglement, to speak to the embeddedness, and to make that obvious, and so that to help give the tools, if you like, for people to be able to promote that argument at every possible opportunity, that the law, wherever it's seen to be this abstract or governing thing, that in fact it always is a product of much deeper and longer and more expansive connections. So really, my objective was to reorient, to change the perspective, so that law becomes a smaller thing, if you like, in the normativity of the world, rather than the first and only thing that we ever think about. So law is a secondary thing, and I think that even though we have to use law, we have to rely on law. It's part of our kind of it's part of the toolbox that we have in order to meet, you know, ecological challenges and crises and so forth. I wanted to, just present this image that it's only a small, tiny part of the broader normativity of the earth, because I really think that's what's really lacking in Western legal thinking, in Eurocentric and colonial legal thinking. that understanding that law is, you know, that human law is just, you know, a small part of the earth and earth systems. So, but as to, you know, what it means in terms of developing our own human law, that's a more difficult question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So good question.
I think this, like as I was saying in the chat, maybe this is one line of speculative research that we are discovering to explore as a group also, like, you know, how to re-elaborate our legal thinking and institutions and practices to transform the relations between those different levels and strata of law, right? Not only of normativity, but of law that you're helping us conceptualize, right? Actually,
Sorry, I was saving the chat. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would like to add a point to the last sentence which you said, Professor. The thing is, okay, there are two words in Sanskrit, swabhava and sahaja, and both of them are translated as nature, and that's why that's how Ilya also got his idea, Pregogain. And I've seen this in two other papers, one written by a theologian. When Spanish went to Mexico, they reduced all the, not, it was basically, I think, Hose, I forgot his full name. He wrote this book, a natural and moral history of natural and moral history of Indies. So he reduced all the Mexican or Inca thought into natural and moral. So maybe if we can go beyond the word natural, then what you're trying to capture can be captured in words. I would like to tell that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. You know, and I've had problems with these words all along. Words like nature, they're very problematic in some ways. And yeah, obviously expressed in so many different ways in different languages and cultures. So they're, you know, really difficult to negotiate those terms. But I'd like to, be great if you could email me some of that, some of those names and references so I can look them up, because it's really fascinating what you say about Prigoghine's connections and, you know, the background that he used.
Tom?
Yeah, so does anyone who hasn't participated yet want to say something? Like, have you been thinking about anything relating to our discussion? Let me see. I think I have some questions here as well. I don't know. I don't want to.
I was just wondering with Margaret, because we have been discussing for almost 2 hours, if it's too much for her.
Yeah, we hadn't warned Margaret in advance that that it would be like how long the discussion would be. So also, if you're feeling tired, please feel free.
Otherwise, she doesn't come back. Don, you have to be strategically.
No, it's quite late, but I'll come back for sure. But I'd like to stay for the discussion. We're going to have a discussion about the you know, progress of the group.
Yeah, maybe we can take these 15 minutes now to talk a little bit about that as well. Do you think I should keep the recording on for that or turn it off? I think we probably turn it off so everyone is more comfortable. Would be like the more internal part. So if you're watching this later and you want to, participate actively in the construction of the group, don't hesitate to contact us. We are an open network and we want to connect to as many people interested in these themes as possible. So yeah, thanks everyone who is watching, and please check out what our current activities are, whatever time frame you're in.